Hi, I'm Srimila Kani, and this is Phase 2, a podcast about quitting my job to find work that's more meaningful. Last episode, I spent a bunch of time looking into my past to try to find some inspiration for the kind of work I want to do in the future. I concluded that starting my own company might give me the freedom and the kind of flexibility that I'm looking for. So I've started that journey. Over the years, I've heard all kinds of advice about entrepreneurship. I've known a handful of people who've started successful companies, including a person who bootstrapped her own e-commerce business over the course of 10 years, and a few people who've raised money from venture capitalists and sold their businesses. There are a couple of principles that keep coming up again and again. One is this idea of working on problems that actually exist rather than on problems that you imagine exist. There's a really famous startup accelerator called Y Combinator, and they talk about this a lot. Their slogan is, build something people want. Their CEO, Michael Siebel, talks about how it's important to work on a problem that you have yourself, because then at least you know that it's a real problem and not something that you imagine exists. The other advantage it gives you is that it lets you iterate more quickly because you intuitively know what features are going to matter and which ones aren't, and then you can quickly test if something's working or not. Another piece of advice is to have a concrete plan for how you can acquire customers. If you need to pay to acquire customers and your market is relatively big, then you're quickly going to be faced with a bunch of competition and it's probably not going to be a profitable channel going forward. I talked to a friend who's launched 3 successful consumer-oriented businesses over the course of the last 10 years. He's built the ultimate lifestyle company. It's a business of 2 people. They generate hundreds of thousands of downloads a month. And their products look relatively simple. He told me that there are 3 main things that have contributed to their success over the years. One is creating a great product. You can't get around solving real problems for people. The second, they got into the Android App Store really early as the best product in their specific category. And then the third was, their product is inherently social. People are downloading it to be able to create slideshows for themselves, and they share that on social media, and then people discover their product through that, and then they are able to acquire customers. 97% of all of their customer acquisition has been organic over many years, which is an incredible achievement. The final principle is to quickly build a minimum viable product to test whether or not your core product is solving real customer problems. And to do that, I'm going to have to build a team. So my plan with this company is to try to bootstrap it and build a prototype with a couple of friends before I try to get any investors involved. I think that if you can show some traction with an initial prototype, you can get a lot better terms working with investors. Doing that is going to require me to convince 1 or 2 engineers to join me as co-founders and to build an initial prototype. So I started to reach out to former engineers that I've worked with over the years. I'm looking for somebody who's skilled, trustworthy, and more importantly, is interested in the area or the problem I'm trying to solve. The person also needs to have the free time to work on this on the evenings and weekends, or is insane enough to kind of quit and work with me on this full time. It's pretty difficult to find people with these requirements. Really good people are usually in demand and they're usually getting paid really high salaries. I did video calls with about 10 former coworkers to try to pitch them on the idea. So when I'm pitching engineers, they usually have really good BS detectors. So I go into those conversations with a lot of humility about the things that I know and the things that I don't know, and I stick to the facts. Most of the people I pitched thought that the customer problem I was looking at was a pretty important one, but I had varying degrees of interest in their, in actually working on it. One of the first people I pitched was my friend Jen, who is an engineering manager I've worked with in the past. She could relate really strongly to the idea. She sort of has it herself. And she was excited to work on something new. She was getting a little bit bored in her day job. And she actually signed up and wanted to work with me on it, which was awesome. She was not planning to quit her job, so I basically had 8 to 10 hours a week of her time to be able to work on this, which was pretty exciting. It was only a couple of weeks in, I'd already found a partner who was interested in working on this project with me. Jen and I get along really well. We're both Canadian. We're both very direct. We're both pretty intense. When we work on something, we want to go all the way. A few weeks later, I met with Victor. Victor and I worked together probably 6 or 7 years ago. He was a 20-something engineer, sort of digital nomad, traveling around with his girlfriend, working remotely. And when I worked with him, I thought he was awesome. He delivered tons of results. One characteristic I really liked about him is that he was kind of unafraid to go into random parts of the code base to get projects done, and that felt like a really good quality to have in an engineer, willingness to be flexible. So I reached out to him over email, and he quickly got back to me and said that he was interested. We met up over Zoom, and it turns out that You know, he's now married and he has a young kid, but he does have the time for side projects. So he was interested in the problem that I pitched him, and he signed up. So after Victor signed on, I was pretty much on cloud nine. It was only a few weeks into the project. I had already recruited 2 kick-ass engineers to work on this with me. I had talked to a bunch of customers to validate it. I had some UX designs created, and we were rolling. The next day, I set up a project kickoff to introduce Jen and Victor to each other. We talked about our personal goals, about the risks in the project. We talked about what the MVP needed to do. We also sketched out who's responsible for what parts. Victor was going to take on all the server experience part, and Jen was going to take on all the app development. We also talked about what amount of commitment each of us would have to the project. I'm full-time working on it, so I'm all in. And Jen and Victor both agreed that they'd be working on this 8 to 10 hours a week. And that felt like enough to be able to get this thing going in the next month or so. We agreed that we wouldn't set up a formalized corporate structure until we'd worked together for a bit have a trial period. That night, I stayed up way too late because I was just buzzing from the excitement of getting something off the ground. Browsing Netflix, I came across a show called Halt and Catch Fire. Check it out.
Reverse engineer an IBM PC with me. I want to build a computer that nobody else has the balls to build.
Are you out of your mind?
There's a project I want to discuss with you.
If it goes wrong, I'm a college dropout repairing VCRs for $3.25 an hour.
I was brought up to believe that the things we built were the singular contributions to computers that history would remember. For a long time, it was true. But now, it's our turn.
So this show takes place in Dallas, Texas in 1983. It's the start of the PC revolution. It's about 3 people who reverse engineer an IBM PC to create the first laptop in the world. The person in the preview is Joe McMillan, the eccentric and unstable product manager who recruited those 2 engineers to work on the problem with him, and somehow was able to convince investors to be able to invest in the project. So he sells them all with his bold vision, but throughout the show, you don't know whether or not this guy is the real deal or just another flimsy hack. Is the universe trying to tell me something? Within the first few days, Jen started checking in code like crazy. The client app was starting to take shape every day. There was lots of visible progress. On the other hand, the server pieces were not going as well. Victor promised that the first version was going to be checked in by the end of the week. That came and went, and on Monday I checked in with him to see how things were going, and he told me it was going to be delayed by a couple of days. When he did deploy it, it did not meet our expectations at all, and he had to be reworked. Then we fell into a pattern. Each day, Victor would promise things would be done, and then they wouldn't be done the next day, for a variety of reasons. Since he's based in Eastern Europe, it was kind of painful because we only had an hour or 2 of overlapping time, and if a deadline was missed, then we had to wait the entire next day to be able to see any results on the changes. Finally, after a couple of weeks of this, Jen confronted me, and she just felt like she was frustrated. She just felt like Victor was not, on the same page as the rest of us. And I assured her that, Victor had always delivered results for me in the past and that we needed to give him a little bit more time, but I agreed that I would meet with him to find out what was going on with him. And the next day I met with him and I asked him how he thought things were going. And he told me they were going fine. I told him I didn't think they were going fine and that we were hoping to move faster than we are today and that we had started to lose some confidence in his ability to deliver. And I asked him whether or not he was actually committed to this project or not. First, he thought that it was the characterization was unfair. We ended up kind of going through some of the details of the things that had gone on in the last few weeks, and he agreed that they weren't really ideal, and that he didn't really understand that we were treating this project with some urgency, and that for him this was more of sort of a side thing that he would work on when he had the time. But he did say that he was, committed to working on this and that he would sort of change his level of investment. About 4 days after that, we were supposed to have another milestone, another delivery of product. When it was delivered, it wasn't functional. And then Victor went offline for a day and we were out of communication with him. And Jen and I met up after that and we agreed that something needed to change. So working in the corporate world, I've had to deal with employee performance issues, both of people who have worked for me as well as peers of mine. And it sort of follows a typical pattern. You bring things up first. You give feedback on individual sort of deliverables, and then in one-on-ones, and then you escalate to managers, and then HR gets involved. And this is a process that can take months. But this is my company, and we don't have the luxury of months to go and deal with these kinds of issues. So my options were either to have another one-on-one with Victor and wait for him to kind of improve, and or to kind of cut ties right away. So the thought of waiting another couple of weeks and then basically be at the same state but just have lost time felt like a really bad option. So we made the painful decision to part ways with Victor after only 3 weeks of working together. So this is difficult for several reasons. First, I brought Victor into the project, so I kind of felt a responsibility to give him a chance. And also, I considered him a friend, and I also knew that he has the skills to actually make this successful. On the other hand, Jen was very frustrated by this entire situation, and I couldn't afford to have her lose motivation. And I didn't really understand what the root cause of the problem was, but in some ways it doesn't matter, because what matters when you're building something like this with such limited resources is getting results. So I rehearsed the conversation before we met. I wanted to phrase things in a way that kept it kind of positive, but I also wanted to be very clear. I kind of had flashbacks to times when I've had to let people go in the corporate setting. And in those situations, I always felt really sort of supported by managers or HR. But in this case, I didn't really have anyone to kind of help me do it. I kind of had to kind of go through it myself. And when I met with Victor, for some reason his video wasn't working. So we were just over audio, which in some ways was easier because I didn't have to look him in the eye. I told him that, I thanked him first about for the contribution so far and for his effort and ideas. But I told him that, things were not going in the direction that we wanted them to be going. And so we were going to part ways with him. And he honestly made it really easy for me. I mean, he said he was disappointed, but he understood that he hoped that we could work together sometime in the future and to keep him updated on how things were going. He was so gracious and respectful to the very end, which I guess in some ways is why I wanted to work with him in the first place. So that was a difficult week. We're 1 month in and shit is getting real.